So the advantages of utilitarianism is that it advocates for policies that provide the greatest benefits for people. So it really works hard to say, how can we maximize the benefit for everybody? Of course, there are challenges, as we saw with the Ford Pinto example, whereas they weren't really thinking about the most beneficial for everybody. They were talking about what was most beneficial for them. So theoretically, it should argue the greatest benefits for everyone involved, but in fact, the way it has been misinterpreted or violated is that it says the greatest benefits for the company itself. And that becomes a focus of self-interest and not really about how we are ensuring that we don't do any harm. It says that it's impartial considering everyone's interests. But again, if you are saying greatest good for the greatest number of people versus what Ford Pinto did, which was to look at how they should do a cost-benefit analysis in order, excuse me, in order to do make their decision, then they weren't thinking about everybody's interests. They really only were thinking about their own interests. And it does explain why some activities are considered to be right or wrong. It's a fairly straightforward calculus. It's a very straightforward formula, although at the end of the day, there are some flaws to that, as we'll see in a few minutes. In order for us to adequately and carefully and accurately weigh the difference between costs and benefits, we have to be able to measure it. And so there are some problems with measurement because let's start at the top. Sometimes utility is subjective. What I consider to be useful, what I consider to be beneficial, you might not. So even though it might be beneficial to many people, it is not uniformly beneficial to all people. And so that subjectivity in those comparisons can be very difficult when it comes to measurement. And some things are just simply impossible to measure. How do you measure the impact of moral outrage when you make a decision to allow an accident to occur and a death to occur in exchange for financial benefits for yourself, like in the Ford Pinto situation? Next is the benefits and costs are sometimes unclear. Like I might be clear about a benefit, but maybe not a cost, or I might be clear about a cost, but not necessarily how to measure benefits. And so it is important if we're going to weigh costs versus benefits that we have a clear understanding of both and can measure both. And it also assumes that all goods are commensurable, like that they can be quantified very easily and that we can establish a value. Now, how do we value, right, a human life? And so that becomes challenging for us. So what are some of the measurement objections? That utilitarians justify their decision-making process by focusing on these claims. Number one, that we're really addressing moral estimates, not absolutes. So utilitarianism does not purport to believe it has an absolute understanding of what is considered to be moral. Number two, that it appeals to intrinsic and instrumental goods. And that's true in theory, but in reality, how people will abuse it is by looking at the extrinsic. And you look at what Ford Pinto did. They looked at extrinsic numbers and not really focused on some of the intrinsic issues. It distinguishes between wants and needs, right? Because what we need versus what we want can be very different. And so it tries to differentiate between what is needed, what is wanted, and what are the costs and benefits of needs versus wants. And then it quantifies value in monetary terms. And not everything, I believe, that not everything can be quantified monetarily. Again, look at moral outrage from an organization that chose to do a cost-benefit analysis on human lives. You can't really distill an individual down to their monetary value. That my family doesn't have a monetary value. My family has an unlimited value to me, and the loss of them is painful, and there's no money in the world that's going to make up for the loss of a spouse or a child or a parent, in that situation. And so the measurement issues are really challenging here, and I do think that utilitarianism as a theory tries to address these issues, but it's not a perfect problem. It's not a perfect solution to their problems. This doesn't mean that it's not a decision of value, but the way I like to think about these ethical theories, particularly these 5 different categories, is that any one of them is not perfect, but combined together, if we consider all of them, we can come up with as close to a good ethical response to something as is possible. So we need to consider solutions that remedy and resolve all of the challenges that are associated with each of these ethical theories to come up with a solution that meets all the standards of excellence for them. There are some problems with utilitarianism, particularly around rights and justice. Number one, it does not take into account how evenly utility is distributed among members of society. And there are some groups that we know are marginalized, that are more likely to be negatively affected um, by the costs and the challenges of an ethical decision. And oftentimes this group is the same group time and time again that has problems with being given the short end of the stick, if you will. So this is problematic. So we cannot assume that that utility is evenly distributed, because there are some groups that are still more likely to have a greater negative impact than another. It also doesn't take into account the negative impact on the rights of those negatively impacted by its calculus. And what that means is, if I am going to be negatively impacted, don't I have the right to live without harm? Don't I have the right to live without being taken advantage of? Don't I have the right to feel safe? And so think about the families in the Ford Motor Company Pinto case. Don't those families have the right to have their loved ones with them, to not have that pain and suffering and loss attached to them? So I think this is really important key here. When we think about some of the problems, is we forget that not everybody is the same. We treat them the same, but they're not. There are some groups that are harmed more, and we ignore their rights to have their loved ones with them, their rights to not live under unsafe conditions or under harm. And so this is key. Utilitarianism sort of responds to this by thinking about this notion called rule utilitarianism. And they argue that our utilitarian analysis is really about moral rules. It doesn't apply to everything. And there's the debate, of course, is whether or not something is moral, right? Ford Motor Company would tell you their decision was financial, that it wasn't necessarily a moral decision, whereas others might see it as a moral decision. You know, do you take care of the safety protocol that you need to do for $5, or do you just let people die? And for us, it's a moral issue. For others, it may not be. So the question is, of course, you know, how do we define what are the moral rules? That goes back to the stuff we talked about in Chapter 1. And how we frame something, you know, is really important when we're thinking about the notion of what is a moral rule or what is not. So they also argue that the correctness of a rule is determined by the total utility produced being greater than it would otherwise be. And this I can buy into, right? The notion that we want the greatest good no matter what. And so our goal is to make sure we maximize the goodness. Now, of course, the challenge is we don't always maximize it, and maybe we can't maximize it because we can't always know all the circumstances. But sometimes even when we do know all the circumstances, we're always not willing to maximize the good. We're willing to do a trade-off that could harm people, which can be problematic. And it also assumes that everyone follows the rule. And again, that's not true. Not everybody follows the rules of engagement. Not everybody follows what they should or shouldn't be doing. Oftentimes, people choose not to engage in certain behaviors because they don't want to follow those rules. So we have to find a way to make sure everybody has the same assumptions, is willing to follow the same rules in order to be able to make utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism work. And that's the challenge that we have with this one.
The first bit of information in this module is from the textbook. And what I'm going to do now is transition to some supplemental information that adds to the theories, and in some ways I think makes them a little easier to understand, and they're less focused on the economic aspect of these business ethical theories and really focuses on how they can be applied in a more reasonable fashion. So you'll see this for the next couple of theories. I add some supplemental information at the end of it, and we'll start with utilitarianism. So before we get into talking about utilitarianism in some more detail, I want to refresh us on the concepts of ethical decision making. And while we talked about some of this in week 1, addressing decision making process in and of itself, I'm talking about this here because this gives us a framework within which we want to be applying our ethical theories. So when we think about the ethical decision making process, it's basically an 8-step process, right? We first identify the dilemma, which we've already talked about. We have to obtain all the facts. The goal is, of course, to obtain unbiased facts, but we all know, right, our search for information and our way of processing things often can be very biased. So our goal is to try to be as unbiased as possible. And then when we get to this concept of the alternatives, we have to look at what are some of the different alternatives out there. What choices do we have, basically? And one of the things you should be aware of, right, when someone says, here's the dilemma, you can choose A or you can choose B, they're framing the debate for you. They're framing the argument, and they're framing the choices that they want you to make. I challenge you to think about it differently. I want you to think about it isn't always A and B. Sometimes it can be Y. Sometimes it can be Z. Sometimes it'll be Q. The point is, even if someone says, well, here's the dilemma, choose A or choose B, you can sometimes say, I don't choose either. I think that this is a better solution than the ones that you recommended, and I think this is the direction that we need to go into. So keep that in mind as you think about alternatives. It's not always A plus A or B. It sometimes can be something entirely different than we hadn't thought about before. So your alternatives should be really expansive. Don't let yourself be limited by a narrow focus on one or two choices. In terms of stakeholders, that's the next step in the process. And the stakeholders are about who has an interest in the outcome of this issue, or who's being affected by this issue, and how much power do they each hold in this scenario. And I want you to be aware that stakeholders are fairly broad. Shareholders, who are the people who own stock in the company, are a stakeholder, but they are not the only stakeholder. Often I hear students interchanging shareholders and stakeholders as if they mean the same thing, and they don't mean the same thing. A shareholder is a stakeholder, but not all stakeholders are shareholders. Often stakeholders can be employees, people in the local community, the government, customers, suppliers. Anybody who is affected by the actions of the organization is considered a stakeholder. The shareholder obviously gets a lot of weight in the company, but it is not the only group that we should be paying attention to, which is why I just want to make sure that we're clear here on this. Next, we'll talk about the impact then on each stakeholder. So this is where we start to think about those ethical theories. And we say, geez, under this theory, this stakeholder is affected, and is it or is it not ethical the way that they've been treated? So when we go through this process, your analysis is going to be, how is the stakeholder impacted, and what is happening that's positive, what's happening that's negative, what is a benefit, what's a harm, and making sure we're clear for each stakeholder who they are and how are they affected. Then we'll go on to number 6, right? The additional assistance. Guidance from your ethical theories, your profession, your organizations. We never should feel like we are alone in making an ethical decision. We should always feel like we can turn to a trusted companion, our significant other, a colleague that you know is going to be honest with you, your best friend, it doesn't matter. Your mom, your dad, it doesn't matter. The goal here is to find somebody that you can bounce the ideas off of so you don't feel like you're doing this by yourself. And here's where we start thinking about, well, if it were utilitarianism, what would the analysis tell me? If it's universalism, what would that analysis tell me? If it's the justice theories, what would that analysis tell me? If it's virtue ethics or ethics of care, what would those analyses tell me? And then we have to decide what to do. So part 7 is the action that we take. The goal here is to think about two things. Number 1 is, well, 3 things. The dilemma, how the dilemma affects the stakeholders, and ultimately analyzing the impact on the stakeholders using each of those lenses. So it's a 3-part process. What is the dilemma? How are the stakeholders affected? Who is most important? How are they affected by this issue? And then apply each of the theories. And so you might have, under universalism, an argument that was completely unethical. But yet you could be under utilitarianism where you might argue, well, it's completely ethical based on that theory. And so it's important for us to understand what impact each theory has on the analysis. You could also find a situation where both of those theories say it's unethical, but it's unethical for one reason under universalism and an entirely different reason under utilitarianism. And I can't, you'll have plenty of time to practice this in class. There'll be assignments, and obviously you have a big ethics paper that you'll be doing at the end of the term. But the goal here is for you to be thinking about the 3-part process. What's the dilemma? How are they impacting the stakeholders? And how do we think about the theory and whether or not whatever the issue is it ethical in the way that our stakeholders have been treated? And that's what drives you to your action, which is part 7. The action should be one that means no matter what ethical lens you look at, it would be considered an ethical outcome under all 4 lenses. That's the goal that we want at the end of the day. It's not that I'm choosing universalism versus utilitarianism, because they're not right or wrong. I might be more utilitarian, you might be more universalist, somebody else might be more justice focused. But really what matters is when we come up with an action, a solution, can we say that it is ethical under all those scenarios? That's our goal. Because we don't want a situation where the universalists say, well, that's completely unethical. But the utilitarians are saying, no, it's completely ethical. We want a solution where both of them would look at it and go, no, that works. It's ethical under that lens. So anytime you're making a recommendation, I want you to be thinking about how can I make this ethical under all 4 lenses, and to be able to explain why. Lastly, obviously it's about monitoring the outcomes and making sure that we are monitoring what we see and why, and making sure that what we've done makes sense, that we have ensured that we've gotten the unbiased facts, that we've made sure we've exhausted all our alternatives that we could possibly think of, that we have addressed all the possible stakeholders and the impact on them, and then ultimately chosen an action. And so we have to evaluate every step in that process.